There is a really powerful message behind the scenes in today's first reading. One of the things we're looking at, again, we're continuing in Samuel, and what we're ultimately seeing is that Samuel is going to choose David as the successor to Saul. Now, notice the passage begins, what you're going to hear at Mass today, is the Lord says to Samuel, how long are you going to mourn for Saul? Saul's not dead. Saul's quite alive, and Saul is still king. But Samuel knows what the future of Saul is, and Saul knows what the future of Saul is. Saul has been rejected by God as king. Now, there's an important distinction there. He hasn't been rejected by God as one of the people of Israel. He's been rejected by God as the king. And things didn't work out. It happens. We know those stories, but he has been rejected by God as king. So what we're looking at the same time is that Samuel is now going to choose who the next person is going to be. And if we know that story, he goes and he calls the sons of Jesse. Now, if you're familiar, it's very common among certain religious education programs to have what is known as a Jesse tree. And it's the tree, it's usually celebrated around Christmas. It's the tree that represents the children of Jesse, and one of whom becomes David. So, and we have that scene where Samuel goes to visit each one of the sons and finds that the Lord has not indicated to him which one is going to be the king. And then he finds out there's another one. He's a shepherd boy. And the whole thing, a common theme that we see in all kinds of literature is, he was out as the shepherd boy. No one's going to pick him. He's too young, et cetera, et cetera. But he is the one who we ultimately know is chosen. Now, one of the things we have to look at when we look at that, sorry, I didn't mean that the way. One of the things we have to look at when we look at that, well, what is it we have to look at? Hey, one of the things we want to look at is a theme in the Bible is always why God should not choose you. And one of them is, I am too young. Another one is, in the case of Moses, I stutter. There is 1,000 reasons why someone should not be chosen by God. And again, he is too young is common. You find this in Jeremiah, and you find this also in right here with the choosing of David. And keep that in mind, especially if you're running a youth group or if you have someone who's a member of a youth group and they're saying, well, who am I? I am, not old enough. I'm just a teenager. Well, let's go back. Let's look at the story of the people who were called when they were young. All of us are called at our baptism, and the call is confirmed at our confirmation. And don't forget what St. John Chrysostom said. The same Holy Spirit who came upon the apostles comes also upon you at your confirmation, including whoever is being confirmed. I think they're doing a thing up in some of the New England states. Thank God we're not doing that here. It started with the bishop, as I understand, it started at least in the New England states. It probably has some connection to Rome, but it started with the then Bishop of Vermont, who is now the Archbishop of Connecticut, of Hartford, rather. Sorry to all the other dioceses of Connecticut, although technically he is the one archbishop. But it was this idea, I think confirmation is held at First Communion. And I was at a parish that bordered New Hampshire, the Manchester, New Hampshire, and in Manchester, New Hampshire, it started to follow the same way. And there I was at the parish that was, and we said, well, we hope the Archdiocese of Boston doesn't do that. The Archdiocese of Boston which borders the Diocese of Manchester, New Hampshire, came up with the decision to lower the confirmation age to the 8th grade. Now, I haven't taught confirmation in several years, and I always liked teaching confirmation, but, I'm 67 years old. What connection do I have to the youth? I suppose I have some, but, I look at it as, and people have said, don't think like that. I guess I'm doing exactly what I just told you not to do in reverse. I'm too old. God could not be calling me to do this work. Well, it's the same thing. I'm too young. And this is the situation that happens. I'm too young, or he's too young. The case of Jeremiah, no, I'm too young. The case of Moses, I stutter. The case of Isaiah, I was a dresser of sycamores. The case of Jeremiah, again, too young. The case of David is, he's the young kid. He's out shepherding sheep. So all of us at our baptism are called in service to the Lord. And remember, the early Christians were called prophets. They weren't called Christians, they were called prophets. So everyone has that call. Well, now we see what happens is they ultimately choose David. And David grows up to be the king. Now we're going to look at the stories between him and the king, and there's fascinating stories about David. And one of the things to keep in mind is David is also considered a prophet. He is considered the author of the book of Psalms. He was clearly a mystic. He had a deep personal relationship with God. And there's something that's important to notice there. David committed a grave sin. That's something to discuss at another time. David committed, he committed several grave sins, but he committed a grave sin, which we all know about, which involved adultery and murder, and also trying to cover it up. My favorite line about David's cover-up is, it worked so badly that 3,000 years later, we're still talking about it. So we see all that happening with David. But one of the things to look at with David is you clearly have an indication of what David should not have done, where the Lord responds to him. But then you also see other things David was involved in, and we don't see the Lord saying, you shouldn't do that. So that's something to keep in mind, especially as we get to some of those parts. Well, in any case, we're looking at this powerful story of David, and he's chosen. Now, the Lord is going to work out how the change happens, and we're going to be looking at that later. But now you see that David was the one who was appointed by God to become the next king. Now, we saw Saul was the king. He still is the king, and that plays an important role with David. One of the things you're eventually going to see, if you read through the book of Samuel, is that David had an intense element about Saul being God's appointed one. And this is something that's important. Now we know that we have Pope Francis, and, obviously not now, we've got Pope Leo, but we had Pope Francis, and there were people in this country, and other countries too, but very rooted in this country, who rejected his papacy. And they even invented a word that if you supported Pope Francis, you were a pope-splainer. I'm sorry, that's all heresy, and it's all wrong. You know why? We can take the model from David. David knew the story of Saul. Saul was rejected by God, but he was still the king, and he was still appointed to be the king, anointed actually to be the king. And David always referred to him as the Lord's anointed, which, by the way, the Pope is also within the concept of what we believe as Catholics. He is the Lord's anointed. No one has any right to dismiss him for any reason. And that's something that was very common in this country. It's one of the reasons why I will not support certain Catholic networks. Catholic TV, obviously, I support, but I won't support certain Catholic, especially TV networks. And you can understand why. They rejected Pope Francis, which means that they said the Holy Spirit did not anoint Pope Francis, or whatever, that Pope Francis, they call him a heretic, they call him everything else. No one has the right to speak about a pope in that way. You can criticize what he says, you can disagree with him, you can do all those things, but you don't have the right to say he is not the Lord's anointed. And this is something that David taught. This is something that actually he didn't teach, he lived. He's whatever the case may be, Saul is the Lord's anointed, and he will be treated as such. This is an intensely important thing to keep in mind. That doesn't mean that you treat someone who is ordained as super holy, and David didn't either, but he understood the difference, and this is an important consideration. Okay, so if someone who is ordained commits a crime, he should be turned over to the police. Period. That's it. But you don't turn around and say, Father so-and-so preach something that is clearly Vatican II, and we reject Vatican II in this parish. No, you don't have the right to do that, because Vatican II and all the councils are quite valid in our church. Vatican II is part of that. So you don't have the right to say that, because what you're saying is that you are appointed by the Holy Spirit and not whoever it is, the Pope, whomever. You can always disagree with your parish priest. You can, within reason, and you put him in a position where he has to explain why he taught what he taught. You can do that. But you don't have a right to tell the parish priest who is teaching Catholic teaching, okay, providing he's teaching Catholic teaching, that he's wrong. You don't have that right. You don't have that right. And I'm very strong on that. One of the things that I'm strong on is when Catholic priests do not teach Catholic teaching. They'll teach something from the Baltimore Catechism, which is... if you've listened to my podcast enough, you know that I absolutely despise the Baltimore Catechism, period, because it's black and white. It's very black and white. Humans are not black and white. It's very black and white, and humans need that. That's what pastoral ministry is. It's taking what is Catholic morality and bring it into a human level. But Baltimore Catechism doesn't do that. It's very black and white. As you know, it's very pithy. You could literally watch someone do this on X, a Baltimore Catechism account. And of course, there may be copyright issues, but you could literally do a question and answer on X, and I think in very rare cases, if at all, you would never exceed the number of characters you're allowed on X. Never. Because it is so pithy, it is too pithy, it's too black and white. Well, this is one of the things. We have to be people of prayer that allows us to have a deep relationship with God, which we are called to do. And to live that relationship, we're not called to simply follow black and white rules, because then we're not living our faith. We're following black and white rules. And you'd literally been in a situation where the Lord might say, I don't know you. Well, yeah, but don't you know? And this is literally one of the signs we see, one of the stories we see in the Bible. Yeah, but I followed all the rules. I did this, that, and the other. Yeah, but you never prayed to me. You never communicated with me. You want to be in communion with me. That's what we're called to do. And when we do that, we're not following black and white rules. In David, we're going to see a very human person, but also someone who had a relationship with God, but still had his humanity. And God is very united with David and leads David to become this great founder of what ultimately becomes the same house, it's always called the house of David, from whom Jesus comes. So we see a very powerful reality with David, but David was very human. But he didn't turn around and say, I am David, I am greater than God. And this is what's important for us to understand. That's why it's so dangerous when someone says, well, we're not going to listen to the Pope. Okay, fine. Then why don't you go join all the other Protestant religions that don't listen to the Pope either? You're welcome to do that because that's who you are. You know, you can say, I disagree with the Pope and this is why. I agree with the Pope and this is why. But the minute you turn around and say, no, I will not recognize his authority, then good. You can go join the other Protestant religions because you're officially a Protestant by doing that. We're going to be back on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast here on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to like, as many of you done. Thank you for that. And don't forget to pass the word about this podcast. We'll be right back. Did you know that the Catholic Audio Media Podcast is available on various podcast platforms? You can find us, among others, on Podbean, which is our home platform. You can find it on Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeart, among others. Just look for Catholic Audio Media, all one word. On some platforms, such as Spotify, look for Catholic Audio Media, 3 words, and subscribe and listen to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts. Previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com. Your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out, patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. We're back, and we're talking about, as you know, we also talk about the various issues that are happening in our country, our world, in light of what it is we believe. And here we're looking at Saul, who is still the king, and he has been basically told, you're fired, but you stay on until we find a replacement. We know how, well, we'll talk about how that happens. And then, of course, we're talking about the replacement is going to be David. Now, remember, this is the Middle East. The Middle East, as you know, as we see in the case of King Herod, in the Middle East, they don't deal with issues well when someone says, oh, that's going to be your replacement to the king. Like, for example, if we were in the kingdom of Saudi Arabia and somehow someone says, well, you know, I guess it's the crown prince, you know, that person is going to replace the crown prince, that person would probably be eliminated fairly soon because they go, no one replaces the crown prince except for the crown prince could name his own replacement, or however it works in the Saudi Arabia. Now you go back 3,000 years and you know that's not going to sit well for Saul. And Saul also is going to feel embarrassed. He was told by God that, no, you can't stay as king. And so he has to live with that. And he has to live with that for quite some time because David is chosen as a very young, probably about 12 years old, but he doesn't replace Saul for a little while. So, and it's not like days. It's quite obviously years. And Saul still remains as the king. But you also have to realize that everyone had to treat Saul as the king. Even if he was rejected by God, which he was, he is still the king. God still put him in that place, and he is to be respected by all who follow him. You can't turn around and say, oh, Saul, we understand God rejected you, so I'm not saluting you. No, it doesn't work that way. And this is an important consideration. Remember I told you what is the source of evil? The source of evil is people turning around and saying, I want my world my way. If you want to see what it looks like, we can see that many of these protest movements are rooted in the teachings of Saul Alinsky. And Saul Alinsky taught people to say, I want my world my way. That's the whole message of Saul Alinsky. That's why if you ever walk into a class and they pull out Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky and saying this is going to be our textbook, drop the class. Do not. And go study the words of Walter Wink. Because Saul Alinsky teaches people how to create the world the way they want it. Whether that was his intention or not, that's what he does. And remember, that's his whole point of dedicating the book to Lucifer as the world's first radical. So, and the fruit of it is you build division. This is where all this division is coming from. You build division, you build people saying, I want my world my way. Well, that's what hell ultimately becomes. Not our world's going to become hell, but that's what hell ultimately becomes. People fighting, people wanting the world the way they want it and fighting each other to get the world the way they want it. And they can't. They can't. The world doesn't work that way. The way the world works, as we understand as people of faith, is we want the world the way God wants it. So we submit to God and his authority within reason. Now, what do I mean by within reason? Kind of what I was saying before is within reason means the person gives a command that is what God would teach or God would want. If the person gives a command that you know is wrong or sinful, then you turn around and say, absolutely not, and walk away if you must. And there's kind of an interesting thing that's a question that came up recently, and that is, should you bow to the priest on the altar? So when you approach the altar, you should bow to the altar, and you depending on where the tabernacle is, you can genuflect to the tabernacle. And this is as you're beginning Mass. But if you are not the priest and you are approaching the altar and you bow to the altar, and then maybe you're a lector, and so you walk over to the ambo and you start to read the reading. At that whole thing, do you ever bow to the priest? No. Don't ever bow to the priest. Now, there may be priests who insist that you bow to them. Isn't much I can do about it, but I always say to people, do not bow to me. Do not bow to the priest. And here's the reason why. Because I am the priest. I know it, you know it, God knows it, everything else. But don't put me on a pedestal, because that's when things go wrong. And this is a really important thing. Don't put the priest on a pedestal. You might say, well, the priest is called to be holy. No, we're all called to be holy. That holiness, priest isn't called to be holy any more than you are, or to put it a different way, the holiness that the priest is called to is the same holiness that you are. So once you get into the idea that the priest is called to a higher level of holiness, it is considered a higher vocation in some circles, but that's not a higher level of holiness. We're all called to a high level of holiness and the same level of holiness. So the minute you turn around and say, wow, the priest is called to be holy, we're just simple lay people, you're in trouble. That's where things go wrong in the church. And we've seen some of these things go terribly wrong. And it really, when I heard about this argument, I got really, really upset. Do not bow to the priest, because you're putting the priest on a pedestal that he does not belong. Now, do you understand that the priest does represent Christ? Yes, it's called in persona Christi, but he's not Christ. He is a representative of Christ, and therefore, since he is a representative of Christ and not Christ, don't treat him as Christ, but only as a representative of Christ, in persona Christi. When he is celebrating Mass, he's celebrating Mass in persona Christi. When he's eating supper at the local McDonald's, he's eating supper at the local McDonald's as Father Joe Smith. He's not in persona Christi. And don't treat priests differently. That's very dangerous. Take it from someone who lives in Boston. I'm going to tell you that right now. That's extremely dangerous. And that's the other thing that it's an argument I get into, or not an argument, a discussion that comes up every so often. What do we do when a priest says something from the altar we disagree with? You tell the priest you disagreed with his homily. I used to have a parishioner at one of my parishes. I'm not going to be too direct about it. who used to send me really nasty emails when he didn't like my homilies. And usually if they were in defense of the church, he'd send me nasty email, really, really nasty emails. I don't agree with what he did, but as little as I agree with what he did, I have more agreement with that than I do with someone who says, oh, no, we cannot argue with the priest. Absolutely. Well, of course you can. If the priest says something you disagree with, and you want to be careful, because always be careful of the priest who says things that you always agree with, because that means he's telling you what you want to hear, and you never want that. You always want a priest who's going to tell you something. People say that they learn something when I do my homilies. I do a little research. It's been a little difficult now because I live on a different schedule. But yeah, you should do something where you are learning something and maybe be challenged. Dorothy Day said a good homily should challenge how does it go? To afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. That's, so a good homily should challenge people. But if I were to say something in a homily and you go, or even on the podcast, that is absolutely unacceptable, you should never talk like that. Well, I will, give me a discussion. And if I don't respond to you, it's probably because I'm too busy. Which is, you can always resend your thing and say, did you miss this? I will make a discussion. I haven't responded to this, but I had a Monsignor who disagreed with a column I wrote for a newsletter. And I said, a lot of times when I go to Mass on vacation, I'm dressed up not as a priest, but as a layperson. I don't go to communion. And the reason is because there are people that may feel that they aren't ready to go to communion, and it's so that they will feel comfortable and there'll be someone else there that helps them to make the decision. And that's one of the reasons why I do it. And he disagreed. I'll be right back right after this. You can now leave a message for us, which we can air and discuss on this program. Just call 617-297-7452. That's 617-297-7452. 617-297-7452. Feel free to call, leave a comment, a question, or even feedback, and we may play it on the air. I can discuss your comment or question as well, so give that a try. 617-297-7452, 617-297-7452. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts. Previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com. Your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out, patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. We're back, and so that's something to think about. Don't ever be afraid of disagreeing with a priest's homily, because, what's his name? Deacon Harold Burke Sivers. He gave a talk when I was at a conference at Franciscan University. It was a fine talk. There was nothing wrong with it. But if you know me well, you can talk all you want. If you don't mention prayer, that's a real issue with me. And I did. And I brought one right afterwards, says you didn't mention prayer. Well, of course I believe in prayer. I forget exactly what he said, but something along those lines. And, of course, prayer is very important. But I always do that. Don't ever be afraid. And if the priest refuses to listen to you, doesn't have time for you, then that should tell you something, because that's his job. That's his position, to help you to understand. So if he says, well, I have written what I have written, which is what Pontius Pilate said, no, that's not good. I have said what I've said. But you don't want to say that. You want a priest who is going to say, well, what did you disagree with my homily? Why did you disagree with it? Unless you're nasty, and I told you about the guy who wrote the nasty letters. It's not that I wouldn't respond. It's I knew, and I talked to him on a regular basis. I knew where he stood, and there wasn't anything else I could do with it. But if he refuses to respond, or I am the priest, you listen to what I say, no, that's not the way it works, to tell you the truth. We'll be back tomorrow. Have yourself a blessed day. We'll see you then. The Catholic teaching in this podcast is reflected and presented as accurately as possible. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Archdiocese of Boston or any other institution.